I said, my name is Stacy McCreary. I do work for the Chester County Intermediate Unit. I am a data specialist for them, and we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about outplaced students for child accounting. We also might touch a little bit on reporting those outplaced students for special ed as well. So just a little bit about me. I did for 6 years. I worked as a PIMS administrator and a child accounting person for a local Lancaster school district. That gave me a huge education in PIMS because I came from the public sector. So we didn't really report a whole lot of data to anybody except maybe, board members or stockholders. So it was very different when I came into education. So that was a great 6 years of introduction and learning how to do all of this. I was hired by the IU back in 2018 as a data specialist, and my job there was more to assist our school districts with their PIMS and child accounting reporting. So we have developed different training programs, consulting services, as well as a best practices manual. So that way we can help our districts. I also am the point of contact for the data governance. So you see me at the DQN meetings, and I am also one of the instructors for the data quality curriculum. That's a part of the DQN. So the goals of the next hour is to really assist you in reporting your outplaced students that were not reported on your behalf for child accounting, as well as to talk about some of the necessary templates in order to report those students. So I say this a lot when I present, but communication is key. A lot of times we as PIMS administrators or child accounting folks, we kind of put ourselves on an island, and occasionally we extend a bridge out to let somebody come on to get some information, and then we pull that bridge right back in because we tend to keep very tight control of our data. Mainly because we know the effort that it takes to get that data in through PIMS and through the DQE. But communication is the key if you're going to make this work with tracking your outplaced students. And it's both internal and external. Internal, you really need to work with your building and your district admin, because a lot of times students get placed out and you're not aware of it, but they are. Same with the special ed director. Sometimes the social worker may be involved, particularly if the student has an attendance problem. Typically the social workers are doing visits. And the other departments that can sometimes be helpful is transportation, because they're the ones getting these kids to that placement. Not always, but sometimes. So I have been known to, drop in on the transportation director and say, hey, so I'm just curious, where are we busing students to these days? And sometimes he can give me, or she, depending on the situation, the lead on, hey, we just started transporting this student here or there. So definitely develop some relationships with those key people so that way you can keep track of some of these outplaced students. Another source that I didn't put on here are also the counselors, particularly at the high school level, because a lot of times if a student is absent so many days, they'll have the counselor reach out, or they'll have a school nurse reach out. And so sometimes you can get information from them as well. And then externally, if you know the placement facility, because sometimes you'll know that, hey, little Johnny was placed at River Rock, sometimes just giving them a phone call can get you the information that you need and can start a line of communication that can go back and forth. Or the educating school district, because sometimes it's not a placement facility. Sometimes it is your district is sending the student to another district, maybe for special ed services or for alt ed services. So just setting up that line of communication so that way they have your email and they have your phone number can really make your life a lot easier. So as far as tracking students, there's several ways you can do this. There's not a right way, there's not a wrong way. It's a matter of picking a way. I recommend that you track them in your student information system. Some people just track them via an Excel spreadsheet. They will withdraw the student if they go to placement or if they go somewhere else, and they will just put them on this Excel spreadsheet and they check the Excel spreadsheet every so often. I prefer to put them in my SIS because then my SIS is already set up to pull templates that I need to report to PIMS. Plus it saves me on a lot of hand entry. And I've done it both ways. So there's pros and cons to both of them, but I have found that putting them and keeping them in your SIS is very helpful. Also, if they're in your SIS, you can track their attendance. We had someone assigned when I worked in a school district. It was their responsibility to check in with each facility and get the students' attendance and then enter that attendance in the SIS. So that way that made it even easier when it came time for reporting child accounting. And it also allows for communications with your other LEA systems. Obviously, if the student is outplaced, they don't necessarily need their little library card or a cafeteria card, but it might be helpful for the transportation system because they're the ones transporting the kid to that placement if transportation is involved. And in addition, it just allows you to track for other key submissions, October 1, December 1, July special ed, and then obviously what we're talking about now is child accounting. Sorry, I just was checking the questions real quick. I will be providing the presentation. It'll be out on Event Squid after we're done. And then my email address is at the end of the PowerPoint. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so tracking students. So if you keep them in your SIS, you have two options. One is to keep them in the building they would normally attend. The other is to create a separate building in your SIS. Either will work. I'll put a little caveat out there that if you keep them in the building they would normally attend, so say this is a high school student and you're keeping them in their high school, you will have to correct your student template because it will not match what's on your special ed template when it gets pulled out of your special ed system. Because in the special ed system, they're going to be marked at an outbuilding, which is quad 9, where when you pull it out of your SIS, if you keep them in the building they would normally attend, it's going to pull the building number and not quad 9. So you will have to fix that. So I always throw that out there, but it's perfectly fine and reasonable to keep them in the building they would normally attend. Or like I said, create a separate building. I have found that creating separate buildings is better for me because I actually have buildings for each building. So for example, if a student's at Devereaux, they're in the Devereaux building. If they're at River Rock, I put them in the River Rock building. I kind of have them separated out. And the reason why I do that is because some of those facilities are going to report on your behalf. So you won't need to worry about October 1 or child accounting. You'll still have to worry about special ed submissions. But by keeping them by building, then I know, okay, it's time for child accounting. I know these ones won't report. I'm going to pull these buildings. So I find it easier to separate by building. But you could also have it just two buildings, PIMS reportable and not PIMS reportable. That would work too. So it's really just finding a system that works for you. Either way, if you keep them in the building or put them in a new building, having a unique homeroom for attendance is important. Also, you are going to need to assign them a calendar, and you have choices there. You can either create a unique calendar to that particular building, or you can create a general elementary calendar and a general secondary calendar, or you can just use the regular building calendar. That's going to be completely up to you, but those will be fields that you'll need to fill in. One, just to help with tracking, but two, to also help with the PIM submissions. So we're going to talk a little bit about the templates. Obviously, if you want to report a student anywhere in PIMS, regardless of what submission, it all starts with the student and the school enrollment template. Now, I list the school enrollment template only because if you don't mark the student as a Y for special ed referral, then you will need a school enrollment template for them, because only students that get the Y do not have a school enrollment template. And then the other two, since we're talking specifically about child accounting, are your PIM school calendar and your PIM student calendar fact. And then lastly, if you are doing anything with the special education templates, because you would have to report these students, because remember, the district of residence is responsible for reporting special ed templates. You would want to include those as well as templates needed. But again, you can't put the bottom 3 in without the top 2, because the student and the school enrollment are the keys that open the kingdom to let you download or upload those other templates. So a lot of people ask me, well, where do you find this information? And I will say that for 90% of the students, you're going to know who they are. Most will be known by your LEA. They will have come back into the building maybe at some point in time, but your LEA has information on those. So it's really just those oddball new students that maybe mom and dad, moved to your district over the summer. And so now that student no longer belongs to a neighboring school district, they belong to you. So, but they're new to you. So I always, when I get my 4605 forms, or green form as they're called, the first thing I do is start looking for parent contact information. And I verify that that student is in fact my student, that, we are their district of residence. And then if I don't know the student, I will call mom or dad and say, hey, did you recently move into the district? We received notice that your son or daughter has been placed here. I do need to get some additional information for you for registration. And for the most part, I find that the parents are pretty helpful. And sometimes the placement is even helpful in getting the parent to reach out to you. But that's the first place I start. Also, sometimes when you get a 4605 form, they'll send along additional documentation. And so, if you receive that, go through it, see what information you can get from it. And then the bottom line is, if I can't get enough information on that form, then call the placement and ask. You can always go into Edna and you can find contact information. There should be contact information on the 4605 form itself, and that person should be able to assist you in getting additional information. And then lastly, if the student was placed by your LEA, then ask that specific department. Go to special ed, go to the building principal, and again, talk with transportation, because transportation is going to know where that child's getting picked up and dropped off. So they might be able to help you with additional information. And then lastly, it's not a great source, particularly if it's not being kept up to date. But, the PA Secure ID system can sometimes offer valuable information. Not always if it's a younger kiddo, but if it's an older kiddo, at some point, a PA Secure ID was created for that student. And when you create the PA Secure ID, you have to put in, the school, the district, and you give, they put in a local student ID. So sometimes I have used PA Secure ID to reach out to that former school district just to see if they can give me any information. And usually when you call, everybody's so nice because we're all in the same boat. But they'll say, oh yeah, that student was here with us up until 2018, but they withdrew, and we have in our records that they enrolled at whatever district out in Pittsburgh. So it kind of gives you a breadcrumb trail to follow. I'm not saying that it's the easiest, and I'm not saying that it isn't time consuming, but sometimes it's what we have to do, particularly if they're at a placement that doesn't report. Otherwise, if we don't report them, some people say, oh, well, it's not enough money for me to waste my time on. But I'm of the opinion that if I would waste my time on my own bank account, then I should be wasting my time on my school district's bank account. Because, when you're missing $20 out of your checking account and you bounce a check, you want to know why. So I kind of take that same approach when I'm dealing with the school district's money as well. I want to make sure that we are getting money back in through basic ed subsidy to pay the placement for the student. So I tend to follow the rabbit holes. So let's talk a little bit now about the templates. The first one we're going to talk about is a student template. And you need to do your best to complete all the required fields. I know that it's hard, particularly if it's a new student that you've never known, that's never been enrolled in your district before. Finding out that information can be very difficult for all of the required fields, but do your best. For dates, just use what's first known. And then if you find out additional information later, you can always update it. If you don't know, I always tell people to defer to null or no, because depending on what you're marking as yes in a category, that could be a category that gets aggregated out for the Future Ready Index. So it's better to defer to null or no. And the other thing I like to tell people is optional fields are just that. They are optional. While it is great to be able to give PDE all of the information they want, their fields are marked optional for a reason. So if you can't get the data, then just skip ahead to the next field. So the school enrollment template, again, if you're not putting in Y for special ed referral, you are going to have to put in a school enrollment template. And you can put in school enrollment templates for kids at Quad 9 locations. Some folks, when I'm training them, people automatically assume that if they're in a Quad 9 building, they don't get a school enrollment template. And that's not always the case, because if they're in a building that does not report to PIMS, then you're going to have to report them. And if you're not putting them in the building that they would normally attend, then they're going to be in a Quad 9 building. So if you're not marking Y for special ed, they will need to have a school enrollment template. And remember that the school enrollment template runs from July 1 until 6/30. So if a student enters, and this happens a lot, they'll go into a facility sometime in June, but then they're still in the facility when school starts in the fall. You don't want to use that June date as your date for the entry code for the school enrollment template, because that's not within the school year. So you want to make sure that your activity date and your enrollment date fall within the school year. And PD defines that as between 7/1 and 6/30. Enrollment codes, depending on your situation, for the most part, you're going to be using EO1 for the first part. If it's, the beginning of the school year, you could be using R11 or R12 if they're bouncing around in placements. So if they're bouncing around in placements that don't report to PIMS, you would want to use that R11 or R12 code and then match it up with that WD 11 or 12 code. In situations where the student is leaving and that facility is reporting on your behalf, then you would probably use a WD02 or WD03, depending on the circumstances. So that way, then you wouldn't have to put up the template for when they transfer. The resident status code typically is always an A. Most of these times, these are not non-residents because you know who they are and you're that district of residents, so they would be A codes. There might be some weird situations where they're not considered an A, but for the sake of this presentation, we're just going to consider them all A, meaning that they're district of residence students. If you have specific questions, I can help you with that either after the presentation or separately through email. Okay, the PIMS school calendar. So if you use the school calendar for the building student, would not attend at that placement. So if you're using that building and you're keeping them in the building of the high school, then you really don't need a new calendar for that kiddo. However, if you're not keeping them in their building of residence and you're putting them in a different building, you do have those options of using other calendars. So you would want to create a school calendar by placement, or you could do it based on elementary and secondary grades. So a lot of times if you create a separate building in your SIS, I always create a calendar for that SIS. And you can either base it on, for that building. You can either base it on the calendar that your LEA uses, or you could call placement and ask them for their calendar. And then so you would build that calendar around their calendar. So that's up to you how you want to do that. But I would, if it were me, I would create that calendar in your SIS so that way it pulls on the state report versus doing hand entry in Excel. I think it gets messy. I also think if you try to go back and look at things from previous years, you might forget that, oh, I pulled these ones out of my SIS, but then I open them up in Excel and I do this by hand. So I'm always in favor of keeping as much information in the SIS as possible, just because it makes me have to remember less. And it also, I don't have to keep documenting my processes each year. So that way, if someone has to go back and duplicate, they're able to do that. The student calendar factor, I kind of broke it out by each field here. So if you're not putting this information in your SIS and you're going to do this by hand, I provided some general information here for you. The nice thing is if you put it in your SIS would do all the calculations for you, which just makes life easier, quite frankly. But I can also argue that if it's this one student over here at this one placement, sometimes it is easier to do data entry. So if you're doing this from your SIS, obviously your district code of instruction is going to be built in to the SIS. The school year date is going to be built into the SIS. Your calendar ID, your student ID, while they're built into the SIS, you still have to assign them to the student. So there is some data entry that has to happen there. If the district code of residence, the funding district, that too is all built into your SIS. So you don't necessarily have to do any data entry for that. You would have to assign the residency status code. So I listed A there, but that too would be a data entry field because you would need to assign that to the student in your SIS. The days enrolled, the days present. If it's in your SIS, and you built the calendar, it's going to calculate it for you, and you're not going to have to do a whole lot of thinking. If you're not doing that, then again, you're going to have to count the days, and you're going to have to do a little bit more communication with that facility. So that way, how many days were they enrolled? How many days were they present? The percentage of time enrolled is built into your SIS. It's usually 100%. Again, if you're doing it by hand, you would type in 100%. Current grade level is data entry. If you are the sending charter school or if you are a charter school or a cyber school, I have marked there that you would leave it blank because I'm looking at this from an LEA's perspective. Because remember that when a student goes to placement, it follows the district of residence. So normally those would be blank. However, I will say there are situations now where some of the cyber and charters are starting to place their students at other facilities because they're unable to meet their needs. So in that situation, if you have to report as a charter or a cyber, you would not leave those blank. You would fill those in. So that way that process for child accounting on the backside, Lori's office is able to track that money per se. Special ed indicator would normally be built into your SIS, but if you're doing this by hand, you would need to call placement. And I do recommend that somebody, and I'm not going to say that it's your responsibility as the PIMS person or the child accounting person, but there does need to be someone at your district that's responsible for contacting these facilities to get attendance information if you have to report. But it's also important to make sure that they don't get IEPs. These students don't get IEPs while they're at placement, because that happens a lot. And if they don't tell you, then your SIS might not be up to date. Your special ed department might not have all the records they need to do the submission for the December 1 and the July 1. So I always tell people that it's very important to reach out periodically to the facilities to make sure the student still does not have an IEP, because a lot of times, like I said, when these kids are in placement, they're exposed to professionals that are specific to their mental or emotional health need, and they may end up with an IEP. But if you don't know that, then you don't have the information for the special ed submission, plus you don't have that information for the child accounting submission as well. Days absent, unexcused. Again, if you're getting that attendance data and you're putting it in your SIS is going to do all that information for you. Otherwise, whoever's calling placement and getting the attendance, you need to make sure you ask specifically days enrolled, how many days they were present, and excused versus unexcused absences. Because there are situations where a student might be at placement, but they get sick. So they don't go to school that day. A lot of people seem to think that if they're at a residential facility, they go to school every day, but that's not always the case. You know, kids do get sick. So it may be, they might even refuse to go to school that day. And that would be an unexcused absence. So you would want to know that information in order to complete this template correctly. So the other two templates that I wanted to talk about were Special Ed Act 16, and then your special education snapshots, 12.1 and 7.1. So as the district of residence, you are responsible for reporting these templates. This is how the December 1 is how you get your additional special ed funding from the state. So outplaced students, I always say that it's 10% of the population of your school, but it's 90% of your headaches. Because there is a lot of communication that has to happen. There's a lot of calls back and forth and emails back and forth to verify that, hey, you know, does this student have an IEP now? Does he not have an IEP? Do you know his grade 9 entry date? Do you know this? Do you know that? So there's a lot of communication that happens. But again, as the district of residence, you're responsible for reporting them. So work with those facilities, work with your internal contacts, so that way you can complete these templates as accurately as possible. With Act 16, those fees that you're paying, those bills that are getting paid, and you might not be seeing the bills. Sometimes only the special ed department sees those bills, but those totals would be a part of Act 16. And even though they're at placement, you would be reporting that information for 12.1 and 7.1. So you would need to know for 7.1, which is coming up, you know, do these students have transition plans? Because a lot of times their IEPs, if they don't have them, they will. And if they already have them, sometimes they get modified because they're at placement. So how are those questions being answered? So that way you can report accurately. And for the most part, I will say 90% of the placement facilities are very good at working with the school districts of residence to make sure everybody has the correct documentation. But it's always good to make sure that that communication line has been established and you are getting all that up-to-date information. So the other thing I want to talk about in this presentation is the CAD system. So my PDE suite, there's a CAD application. If you don't have access and you're doing child accounting, please work with your local security administrator to get access to the CAD application. The CAD application doesn't give you individualized data. It gives you aggregate data, but it does let you see which placements have and have not reported. So that way, if there is some cleanup that the district needs to do, so that way they're getting their basic ed funding, they can do that. So most of the people I've talked to have access to CAD, but I just wanted to throw that out there. And what you can access in CAD is the preliminary summary of membership. There's also a final summary membership as well once all of that gets finalized. The preliminary summary membership is usually available for the first time in September. So the school year ends, though it'll end here in June. You'll get your data into PIMS using those templates in August. And then usually September, middle of September, end of September, they put out PDE, the Child Accounting Office puts out the first preliminary summary. And then they continue to update it every month. So one of the first things that I do when that summary is available is I go and I compare with my SIS and I see, okay, did this facility report, did that facility report? So that way I know which placements, and I just kind of put a check mark next to those kiddos. The important thing to know is that it's aggregate data, not individualized, like I said earlier. So it, you're not going to be able to see individual student information. You'll see that, you know, this IU reported this many days, and then you have to know, or this facility reported this many days. You have to know that this is these students. So that's why it's helpful in your SIS if you break them out by building personally. But again, do what works for you. The big thing to remember is that you do have until December to report these missing students. So don't stress. You know, if you see September and they're still not there in October and you've made phone calls and now you realize that, oh, that place doesn't report, then you still have until December to get those students reported. And after December, you can still fix it. It's just you do it in a different fashion than how you would prior to December and the window closing. But it can still be fixed. So don't stress too much that, oh, what am I going to do? You have plenty of time. So my next slide, I believe, is questions.